Comic Geek Speak presents Murd's Time Bubble, the 28th time. Well, it's taken a little while, but here we are again, and now we are again. It's been an unforgivable 10 months this time, I think, since our last voyage through time together, but finally, you are once again safely, securely, even snugly seated in the cabin of Murd's Time Bubble, and here I stand, Adam Murdo, your captain, commodore, and chrono-navigator, ready to guide you on another magical misery tour back to the days and comics of yesteryear to experience the wonders of reading delinquency. I guess at this point, a few introductions and explanations may be in order for newer podcast passengers. I understand we're always picking up new listeners here at the Comic Geek Speak family of podcasts, and as I've said, it has been about 10 months since the last time I made one of these. So if this is your first Time Bubble experience, if you're a new listener to Comic Geek Speak, or if you're an experienced listener who's just never happened to have tried a time bubble before, what I'm doing here is this is the Murd's Time Bubble is my little solo side project, existing parallel to the main Comic Geek Speak cast. It's my little personal playground where I get to take advantage of the fact that I'm a tiny bit behind in my reading, i.e. the early 2000s. I'm just now getting around to reading, like new, comics that I purchased back in 2003. So this is my own little vessel of isolation where I'm able to pick up these comics that I'm just now reading like new, that are actually vintage back issues by now, and just read through them, review them, pick them apart, and explicate them for your hopefully listening pleasure. So in essence, I'm doing what we do on our Off the Racks episodes. I'm doing these sort of spotlight and more or less detailed reviews of comics. It's the main difference being that they're quite a few years older than the ones you're hearing about on our Off the Racks episodes nowadays. And also, it's just me reviewing them and going to as much shameless, self-indulgent detail as I want. Contextualizing historically, pointing up weird little bits of trivia, making half-baked observations, occasionally bursting into song. It's a good time, for me anyway. So if you've enjoyed my contributions to the Off the Racks episodes that we do on Comic Geek Speak, usually, then, well, let me put it another way. If you're irritated by my contributions to the Off the Racks episodes we do, then you might want to stop listening right now, because this is going to get your goat in a big way. But if you enjoy what I contribute to the Off the Racks episodes that Comic Geek Speak does, you are in for an all-syrup squishy, my friend. It's all Murd all the time on board the Time Bubble. Just in case you listeners didn't get enough of me babbling in our recent Spotlight on Shazam in the Golden Age Part 3 episode, here's another Murdo marathon for you. Hopefully it won't be quite 3.5 hours in length, but I probably will rattle on at some length, so sit back, recline your seats, return all trays to the upright position, and just enjoy the ride. Okay, and I am, as I've mentioned a couple times already, a couple of months overdue for this Time Bubble episode. So I do want to get down to talking about the comics fairly quickly. I always do want to get down to talking about the comics fairly quickly on these episodes, but I usually find other things to babble about in spite of myself. I did want to talk back to a couple of bits of feedback that I got on the forum thread about our last episode, Murd's Time Bubble, the 27th time, which can be accessed at thecomicforums.vanillaforums.com. Well, one of the two things I wanted to mention, on the last episode, I made some mention of Pokemon and how important it was to the mainstream popular culture of the late 90s and early 2000s. It is an important locus of the infiltration of Japanese popular culture, the anime and manga, into the American consciousness. And a couple of you spoke back and put in that we should not underplay the importance of Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon and properties like that in the same regard. And, those of you who brought up those properties, I could not agree more. I was a big fan of both of them. Like the forum member known as Dr. Doom, I watched both of those shows during my formative formative college years. In fact, I'm still enjoying the Dragon Ball Z Kai reruns that are being shown on Toonami on Saturday nights these days. So yes, absolutely, Dragon Ball Z, Sailor Moon, and the like were important gateway drugs for American otaku. It just brought people in to help them cultivate lifelong interests in Japanese sequential art and animation. Not to take anything away from those shows, but I think the point I was making about Pokemon is that even more so than things like Dragon Ball Z or Sailor Moon, it helped to increase the visibility of Japanese animation and comics in this country. It gave them mainstream relevance. Surely Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon and so forth gained a lot of new fans, readers, viewers for Japanese product here in the States, but Pokemon made the cover of Time magazine. Okay, more than just garnering new fans, it captured the minds of an entire young generation, and it made people who never watched and never wanted to watch, and continued not to want to watch any Japanese cartoons, sit up and take notice. It was a breakthrough cultural phenomenon. Yeah, so, again, nothing to take away from things like Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball Z, but Pokemon was I would argue, was on a whole nother level. Now, that's just my 2 cents on that issue. And one more shout-out, tip of the bubble beret to Time Bubble superfan Bionic Dave Goldschmidt, who's always been a big bubble booster, and who chimed in to comment on a remark I made on the last episode about an unfortunate tendency that characters in comic books and also in television soap operas have an unfortunate tendency on the part of writers, creators, and so forth to cause young characters, children, to sort of zip past their childhood years and just sort of hemorrhage their way into adolescence ahead of natural schedule. And Dave was kind enough to point out, since apparently he has written for TV soap operas in the past, that there's actually an insider name for this phenomenon. It's called SORAS, which is an acronym for Soap Opera Rapid Aging Syndrome. So this is a thing. This is something that apparently people who work on these shows call it, and and Dave laid out the reasons why this happens, why young children are considered inconvenient for soap operas, and it made a very good point, And I thank Dave for this bit of insider knowledge. It is a bit unfortunate that some comic book creators, despite the fact they don't have to cope with the realities of production that soap opera writers have to, still see fit to deny younger comic book characters their proper childhoods and just zip them on into adolescence so that they can then gain superpowers and have romantic relationships and all that fun, somewhat soap operatic stuff that tends to happen in superhero comics. So thank you, Dave, for validating my observation there and adding some additional information to it. And Dave, just so you know, you came this close to getting that name drop of "Wait Till Your Father Gets Home" on that last episode that you were hoping for. I was likening an Ant-Man story in Marvel Double Shot back in 2001 to certain animated sitcoms of yesteryear. I mentioned the Flintstones and Jetsons. I came very close to popping in "Wait Till Your Father Gets Home" there because I was aware of the show at that time. I had already seen YouTube clips of the opening sequence with that deucedly catchy theme song. Just go ahead and YouTube it, folks out there. I dare you. You'll be cursing my and Bionic Dave's names for the next 3 months until you can, extricate the earworm from your eustachian tubes. But yeah, it's an old Hanna-Barbera primetime animated sitcom set in the present, unlike the Flintstones and the Jetsons. I thought about mentioning it, Dave, but I thought I would have had to go too far to explain the reference if I'd made it. But, rest assured, I do know the show, and I share your affection for it. All right, so there we go, closing up the old feedback bag now, and pushing forward into cruising velocity as we make our way back to the point in time to which I'm caught up in my reviewing, which, as I've mentioned on earlier episodes, is actually a couple of years behind the point to which I'm caught up in my reading. So I'm caught up to 2003 in reading, but here on the Time Bubble, I'm still going through comics that were published in 2001. So here we go. We continue to hack our way through the underbrush of the comics of the summer and early autumn, shall we say, of 2001, as I continue to mix my metaphors shamelessly. I'm still not sure really whether I'm supposed to be the captain of a chartered tourist time vessel, or I'm like a Han Solo-style time smuggler bringing you shipments of back issues from 13 years ago, and here I am talking about hacking through under pressure. What am I doing here? I don't know. Entertaining you, that's what I'm doing. So, with that in mind, let's start talking about comics. Okay, so, first up on the docket today on the Time Bubble, we're going to start out with yet another sampling from a seemingly endless supply of the spoils of war. Our world's at war, that is. Yes, that's right. It's still in 2001, and we're still not finished talking about that unnecessarily large, bloated, complicated DC Comics crossover event of the summer of 2001, Our World's at War. Yes, ironically timed is another adjective we can add to the list that we could apply to the Our World's at War event, because it wouldn't be too many months before our nation would be plunged into an international conflict, a war of sorts, with forces of the Middle East. But this, as of now, though, this is this first comic I'm going to talk about is the earliest cover date of the few I've got to talk about on this episode. It's October 2001, which means it would have probably seen publication in August of 2001. It is one of the tie-in one-shots. And this isn't like a tie-in issue of an ongoing series. It is a separate one-shot, of which there were quite a few for the Our Worlds at War event. It's actually the Harley Quinn Our Worlds at War special. It's one of the more offbeat tie-in one-shots that were published as a companion to the Our Worlds at War crossover. It's 48 pages in length. It's written by Carl Kiesel, a man known just about as much for his chops as a writer as an inker. He actually doesn't contribute any art at all to this one-shot. And he was actually, as of 2001, the regular writer of the Harley Quinn ongoing series. Yeah, this coincides with issue number 11 of that Harley series, actually. And it, in my opinion, surpasses in quality most of the issues of said ongoing series. I liked it. I liked some of the things that Kiesel was doing with it, but in other ways it fell a little bit flat. But this issue did it for me. And, it's... I have down here in my notes, which were actually compiled some months ago. I've mentioned a few times now that this episode is 10 months after the last one I released. I was hoping to get this out to you about 6 months earlier than it is reaching you, but for circumstances that do not bear recapitulation here, that recording never took place, and I'm just now getting around to it. But when I originally made these notes some months ago, I did see fit to note down here that this issue, Harley Quinn, Our Worlds at War, was brought up in a forum discussion closer to the time of the release of the Suicide Squad movie, when people were bandying about their favorite Harley Quinn stories. The ever-estimable Eric Nolan Withington of Tomorrow's Publishing sounded off on this issue and cited it as one of the better Harley Quinn stories he's read in comics. And, Eric, he's a pro-comics historian, and by anyone's standards, he knows what he's talking about when it comes to these comics. So it was with some delight that I noticed him mention that, since I had already by that time chosen this comic as something worthy of mention in a Time Bubble episode. And so here we go. So it was written by Carl Kiesel, and artwork by Various, actually. The opening sequence, like the first 8 pages, are drawn by someone named Aaron Wiesenfeld, whose work I'm not familiar with. I had done a bit of research, though, and found that he was a Xeric Grant winner at some point. And so he draws the opening sequence. One of Eric's favorite artists, Paul Grist, does the next several pages. Paul Chadwick of Concrete fame pencils pages 18 through 25. The next sequence is done by Amanda Connor and Jimmy Palmiotti. And the last 3 pages, a little conclusion, epilogue, whatever you want to call it, are penciled by Steve Lieber, who also does some of the lettering in the issue. And the whole schmear is colored by Ro Bleyert, B-L-E-Y-A-E-R-T. My apologies if I've mangled that, quarter in the jar. And edited by Matt Idelson. An unenviable task indeed to be responsible for editing anything having to do with this mishmash, this poorly orchestrated slush heap of a crossover. That was Our Worlds at War. Okay, so it's kind of an eclectic motley crew of artists working on this thing. And, for a character who's so mercurial and psychologically unstable as Harley Quinn, sort of crazy quilt of different art styles is actually kind of appropriate for a Harley one-shot, especially one that's set against the backdrop of chaos, upheaval, and unrest that is interplanetary conflict, and which is certainly what's going on in Our Worlds at War. So the story opens, actually, with, of all people, Jimmy Olsen. He's the co-star of this issue. He's actually a blurb on the title page of the issue identifies him as Harley Quinn's pal, Jimmy Olsen, in Our Fighting Forces, which is apparently the title of the story. But it opens with Jimmy out in space on board the space frigate The Paradox, on which the entire population of Metropolis is apparently cooling their heels as they were forcibly evacuated from their city in the midst of this conflagration. The forces of the scary alien tyrant Imperiex, who's supposed to be some kind of half-assed Galactus figure. I never really did figure out what his deal was, but he's a kind of cosmic conqueror. Not a very interesting character at all. But anyway, he's the big bad, and Jimmy Olsen is the Paradox has just taken a pretty serious hit. Jimmy is trying to figure out a way to get off this space ark and get back down to Earth. He accidentally puts on, he's trying to work some communications equipment. He puts on some kind of headgear and accidentally gets some binary code, apparently originating with Brainiac 13, who is one of many significant players in the absurdly complicated military intrigues of this crossover. So Jimmy gets some Brainiac 13 code injected into his brain, and just after that he successfully launches an escape pod and gets sent back down to Earth. And of course not the first, he has a run-in with some of the alien soldiers who are running rampant all over DC Universe Earth. It's just unusually, perhaps not too surprisingly, similar to the maximum security event that Kurt Busiek had spearheaded over at Marvel not so long ago. But Jimmy runs afoul of a couple of aliens who are disguised as policemen, and he's saved from them by Harley Quinn. You guessed it. And Jimmy feeds Harley some cock and bull story he makes up off the top of his head about his trying to get back to Metropolis to be reunited with his fiancée, who is pregnant. And so this is all just an excuse to get to LexCorp Tower in Metropolis, which it's not made clear by the story itself whether Jimmy is consciously aware of why he wants to get to LexCorp Tower, but it has something to do with the Brainiac 13 code that he's got swimming around in his brain right now. So he uses Harley as his way of getting back there, because as Jimmy apparently knows somehow, Carl Kiesel's approach to the Harley Quinn character, his way of making her something a little bit more than just the Joker's girlfriend. The big hook with her is that she's a sucker for a love story. She calls herself the Cupid of crime, as her puddin' is the Harlequin of hate or the Clown Prince of crime. She's the Cupid of crime, and if there's one thing she enjoys more than a good bank heist, it's playing matchmaker. In fact, this Kiesel does quite a bit more with this wrinkle in Harley's character, which largely instilled in her by Kiesel himself, in a later story arc when Harley moves to Metropolis and takes on a secret identity as Holly Chance, the romance advice columnist for the Daily Planet. She gets she's reunited with Jimmy in that capacity, in fact. But that's all in the future at this point. This is, as I said, this one-shot is taking place concurrently with issue number 11 of the Harley Quinn series. So Jimmy Olsen hooks up with Harley and feeds her this phony story about his needing to be reunited with his fiancée in Metropolis. And so the two of them set off on this this kind of oddball buddy movie rom-com road trip from Gotham City to Metropolis, having fun little misadventures along the way. They run into a little street gang made up of former henchmen of various different Gotham City criminals. They have there's a little episode set in the little town of Midway, which is midway between Gotham City and Metropolis. It's a fun little detail that such a town exists, right between these two towns, so thematically opposed to one another, like between diametric poles. There's this little town called Midway. It's not to be confused with Midway City, by the way, home to Hawkman and the Doom Patrol, but it's just a little town, a little burg called Midway. And Harley and Jimmy stop there to fuel up their vehicle, which happens to be, by the way, the Joker-mobile, special cameo by the Silver Age-styled Joker-mobile. It's really kind of an exaggerated design for it. It kind of looks like the fancified, exaggerated depictions of old-fashioned touring cars you'd seen in Looney Tune cartoons. It looks like it's about 15 feet long. But yeah, it's cool to see the Joker-mobile, and Harley and Jimmy get it out of mothballs and drive it from Gotham to Metropolis. They stop at Midway along the way for a little episode at a filling station that has a certain tragic pathos to it, like a grim, gritty pathos that's reminiscent of classic war comics, which is one of the things that supposedly this crazy, turgid crossover is supposed to be going for. Just evoking old war comics, but also taking place in outer space with lots of explosions and hand-wringing. And, anyway. It's an encounter between a local sheriff and an alien being, and Harley and Jimmy are caught in the crossfire. Then, when they finally make it to Metropolis, they have a run-in with the female Furies of Apocalypse. Everybody's getting into the act in this Our World's at War thing. And then, finally, Jimmy and Harley part ways, and Jimmy wanders off to... his story is continued in Superman the Man of Steel number 117. But the adventures of Harley and Jimmy, this story feeds back into Harley's monthly adventures in issue number 14. That is when, cover dated January of 2002. That is when Harley moves to Metropolis, and she stays there for the better part of a year, too. It's like a new setting, new supporting cast and everything for Harley, and it gets her out from under the thumb of Batman and the Joker that much more. It was a good move on Kiesel's part, I think. And so what happens between Harley and Jimmy is... it establishes that those two characters have a past, and Kiesel exploits that, too, when Harley moves to Metropolis, and Jimmy then is somewhat fearing for his life, and it gives Harley a little bit of leverage in using him to set herself up as, in her identity as Holly Chance, romance columnist, just taking advantage of Jimmy, just as Jimmy takes advantage of her to get himself to Metropolis in this story. So the comic as a whole, as stylistically various as it is in terms of the artwork, it's a good read. It really is. I mean, it's got some good bits of humor. The whole thing is told. It's told from Jimmy Olsen's point of view, which is kind of a refreshing break from Carl Kiesel's, in my opinion, spotty attempts to try and get inside Harley's own twisted, addle-pated psyche. It actually reminds me of some of the stranger, more madcap issues of one of my favorite series of all time, DC Comics Presents, which teamed up Superman with a different... strange cameo guest star from somewhere in the DC universe every month. Instead, we've got Superman's pal teamed up with one of the strangest co-stars of all. Plus, added cameos by the female Furies and the Joker-mobile, and a couple of other surprises along the way. The humor is still a little bit forced in spots. I've never exactly thought it to be Kiesel's strongest point, but he's in there trying, and he pulls off a couple of decent one-liners in here. The story, it gladly, gamely, giddily embraces the narrative anarchy that was the Our World's at War event, and it uses it as an excuse for some of the wacky episodic misadventures that Harley and Jimmy have that I've already described to you. But it also... in addition to using it as an excuse, it taps into it as a kind of a tragic undercurrent or counterpoint to the wackiness that's happening in the story. It's got its roots in human suffering, really, and of course, Harley Quinn as the Joker's girlfriend can relish a little bit of human suffering from time to time, but. It's not out of place in the wider oeuvre of the Our World's at War event. It plays fair with the fact that it's tying into this crossover event, and it makes good use of what editorial has handed the creative team as far as what this event is and how they can play off of it. And honestly, I don't think it would have. The story couldn't have been the same or worked as well without the kind of mid-apocalyptic setting that Our Worlds at War provides it. That said, the story doesn't get in any way bogged down in the crossover plot details, and there are a lot of them to keep straight in Our Worlds at War. But it still actually succeeds in advancing the larger narrative. Jimmy has this Brainiac 13 code embedded in his head, and this story just is kind of a bridge explaining how he got off the space frigate Paradox and got back down to Earth and found his way to Metropolis. There are other ways, more direct ways that this could have been done. The escape pod could have just landed in Metropolis, but this gives us a fun excuse for a story explaining how Jimmy gets from point A to point B and disgorges whatever information is in his noggin, and which I assume advances the Our Worlds at War narrative somewhat. I didn't actually read where his story continues in Superman the Man of Steel number 117, and I don't think I ever will, and I don't think I'll miss anything by not reading it, but still, it actually does its job. Jimmy is playing the part of R2-D2, getting the Death Star plans to the rebellion or whatever, and we get this fun little weirdo story with Jimmy and Harley along the way. Let's see, I was getting down to fine details. I enjoyed just about every little section of this story, but the Harley versus the Female Furies segment here is probably the most notable. There's some good bits of humor in here. It's kind of comparing this to Looney Tunes again. Harley pulls a Bugs Bunny mind freak on Stampa, who's the most dim-witted of the female Furies, and she kind of bonds with Mad Harriet, who's the one of the female Furies with whom Harley has the most in common, I'd say. This is actually not Harley's first encounter with the female Furies, by the by. One of the better issues of Kiesel's run on Harley Quinn was the third issue, which was cover dated February of 2001. It's a sleepover party issue in which Harley invites some gal pals over, and the female Furies apparently crash the thing. So she got to meet them all then, and this is kind of a grudge rematch between them. And she and Mad Harriet have a grand old time just throwing random objects at each other. But the most important fact to share about this part of the story, though, is that the art team here is Amanda Connor and longtime beau Jimmy Palmiotti. And these are a couple of creators who have been very closely associated with the Harley Quinn character over the past several years. I invite anyone listening to correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I think this may be the first time that Connor and Palmiotti worked on Harley Quinn in a published comic. This may be the first Connor and Palmiotti Harley Quinn art to be published in a comic, and that's kind of a big deal. And Connor really is, so even from this little segment of this one issue that she and Palmiotti did, you can tell why she's such a great fit for the character and why she's become so associated with her in the past several years, because Connor is renowned for drawing attractive women, and she certainly does that in spades in this story between Harley and the various female Furies, a couple of whom, most of whom are kind of bizarre in appearance, but a couple of them are legitimately sexy, and she does a good job bringing that across. But she's also a great visual humorist, and, comparing this to the old Looney Tunes, it's no faint praise, because some of the facial expressions, the body language. There's one scene where Harley is throwing a bunch of knickknacks at Mad Harriet, and she's kind of experiencing sensory overload, standing there saying, "Too many beautiful things," and the look on her face and the position of her arms up against her body. It's, the facial expressions, body language, just great. And so that part of the story is probably my favorite, and it's certainly, for the reasons already stated, the most notable in the book. One more random bit of trivia here before we move on. I mentioned that one of the scenes in this comic takes place in the little hamlet of Midway, which exists exactly halfway between Gotham and Metropolis, which, again, it's a cool thing that a little town like this exists, bridging the gap between two such vastly different fictional cities, and all that they represent. I kind of wish other people had picked up on the fact that this place exists in the DC universe and made it and fleshed it out as a locale after this one shot. But anyway, the reason I'm bringing it up is because as Jimmy and Harley pull off the main highway between Gotham and Metropolis to get to Midway, they have to use Exit 52 to do so. Now, this is gotten kind of commonplace by now. By 2017, we all kind of expect lots of gratuitous occurrences of the number 52 in our DC comics. We saw that in a comic nowadays, you just kind of, you wouldn't bat an eye, or maybe you'd even roll your eyes a little bit at it. But I ask you to bear in mind, gentle listeners, that this was happening in 2001. This is safely before the 52 maxi series introduced that number to the DCU fandom lexicon. I mean, this is before Dan DiDio even came to work at the company. It's and yet here we are. It's mind bending that the kind of silly little 52 related Easter egg was happening in DC Comics even before 52 was a thing. It's eerie, almost. It's like this number was just destined to become like the gematria for the DC universe and its bizarre complexities and intricacies and holy mysteries. Exit 52 in 2001. Just get your minds around that, longtime DCU fans. This is a heck of a neat little comic. I do recommend it if you read only one Our Worlds at War tie-in. This would be... Well, actually, I'd probably first recommend the Justice Society tie-in, because it has a new version of the All-Star Squadron in it, which was pretty cool to see. But this would definitely be number 2 on my list. And, well, unfortunately, I don't think this is going to be the last time I get away with mentioning Our Worlds at War on the Time Bubble. But we'll see the end of this yet, folks. The light at the end of the tunnel is in sight. Oh, and one last thing before we go. Look for the Jay Lee cover, because it is the cover is provided by Jay Lee. It's Harley Quinn looking up in the sky and seeing Black Hawk aircraft flying overhead. Black Hawks don't actually appear in the story itself, but they're kind of a familiar sight in various Our Worlds at War tie-ins. They're sort of the President Lex Luthor's private Air Corps strike force. Yeah. So, there you go. Harley Quinn, Our Worlds at War. So let's go from the ridiculous to the sublime here as we shift gears a little bit and jump from this entertaining but ultimately silly little footnote of a comic book to a very important comic book of the time period of the early 2000s. This is a big one. It's a milestone. This is... I'm not going to refer to it by title just now, because the actual title... it is somewhat contentious, I would say. But it's that mini-series from the early 2000s that finally revealed the origin story of Wolverine. All right, scripted by Paul Jenkins. The plot is credited to Jenkins, Bill Jemas, and Joe Quesada. That's right, Jemas and Quesada are actually credited as co-plotters on this thing. Yikes. The penciled artwork is by Andy Kubert with digital painting, aka computer color, by Richard Eisenove. And edited by Mike Martz and Joe Quesada, editor-in-chief, and Bill Jemas, president, naturally. So we'll be talking here about issue number Roman numeral 1 of a Roman numeral 6 issue miniseries published in late 2001. Cover date November. In fact, all of the other comics I'll be talking about on this episode of the Time Bubble will be cover dated November 2001, meaning they were published in the fateful month of September 2001. Alright, so this is the first issue of the miniseries. We'll begin with the cover, I think, which was provided by co-plotter Joe Quesada himself. It's really a very striking, iconic, and memorable image. It's a very nice cover image. It's done in tones of gold. It's depicting 3 young people in the tall grass of a hillside in the gloaming of the sunset. And one young man is standing on his feet, and then there's 2 others who are seated. And so it's kind of leading the beholder's perceptions of these 3 characters in a certain direction that the story will later contradict. It's kind of throwing you a curveball there. And the cover, the typeface of all the lettering on the cover is done in kind of a raised metallic lettering. It's somewhat it's somewhat pretentious looking. I take that back. It's somewhat officious looking, but the title itself, as shown on the front cover, is just plain pretentious. This is something I think I've complained about before on this podcast and others, whenever anyone will listen. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine. The title of this miniseries is given as Origin, just that one word on the front cover. All right, and that, I always thought that was just saying a little too little. It's kind of a poor and ineffective attempt at profundity. I'm pretty sure it was a creative choice brought about by Gemmis and or Quesada. I never did like that, and I like even less the decision to name the miniseries that came out a little later, telling the Punisher's origin, to title that Born instead of The War Where I Was Born, which was writer Garth Ennis's original choice of title. But I don't like the title. I think it's just stupid and pretentious to use just the single word origin on the front cover. It doesn't really tell you as much as you need to about the series, its events, and the character whose origin is being told. And from a marketing standpoint, it's just plain stupid to do nothing but put the word origin on the front cover without telling you explicitly whose origin's being told. And anyway, if you open the front cover and look at the indicia on the inside front cover, the lie is given to that stupid one-word title, because apparently the official title of the miniseries is Wolverine, The Origin, which is, in fact, I believe, what appeared on later collected editions of the miniseries, hardcovers and trades and what have you. So, just thumb the nose and roll the eyes at Quesada and Gemmis. It's one of the knuckle-headed creative decisions of the Gemmis era that I still have not forgiven, and in all likelihood never will. It's my hang-up, don't mind me. I've said my bit. All right, so moving past title and cover. But yeah, and the cover, again, the cover art is an instant classic, even if the title on the cover is not. Okay, so moving on to the story. The title of the story is The Hill. Okay, provided by writer Jenkins, which can be construed as a metaphor for isolation, for hardship, for the nigh insurmountable differences between human beings, be it differences of class or internal strife within families, because both of those are on display in this issue. The action is centered around the mansion of the Howlett family. It's set in 19th century, the Canadian frontier during the 19th century. It's a definite period piece, a total period piece. And so yes, it's set at the estate of the wealthy Howlett family, who've made their fortune through copper mining out there in central Canada. Our POV character is a young lady named Rose O'Hara, who is arriving at the Howlett estate to her parents have recently died, and she's being brought in. Apparently, one of the housekeepers at the mansion was friends with her auntie, and so she's due to that connection. The housekeeper lady is taking pity on her and has brought her in to serve as a companion and part-time caretaker to young James Howlett, the son of the master of the house, John Howlett. And so it's about her transition from living in the poor life of the town at the bottom of the hill. There's that metaphorical image again, at the base of which is the town, and at the top of which sits the Howlett estate. And so Rose becomes a part of this world on the top of the hill. Gets to know the people who live there, kindly Master John, his cruel, wretched, miserly, old buzzard of a father who's always hanging around and criticizing everything the kindly younger John Howlett does. He's passed over control of the family business and the family homestead to his son, and since then has regretted it profoundly. So they're hanging around. Also, John Howlett's wife, Elizabeth, who has gone mad, spent some time in a sanitarium, and she just kind of prowls around the attic wearing a black dress and widow's weeds all the time. Apparently this was brought about by the death of the Howlett's older son, and now all they have left is sickly little James Howlett, who's stuck in his bed most of the time. But he takes a shine to Rose, and the two of them become fast friends. And then there's also Dog, he's the third child of there are only three of them living at the Howlett estate, so the three of them naturally form friendship of necessity. Dog is this little unruly ragamuffin of a kid who's the son of the groundskeeper of the Howlett estate, one Thomas Logan, who happens to be a dead ringer for a certain knucklehead well known to X-Men fans of the present day. So those are all your characters. It's just kind of a slice of life thing. This first issue just establishes what life is like for these children at the Howlett estate in 19th century Canada, and it takes place over a period of several weeks. We get to see a Boxing Day celebration. You know, how Canadian can you get? Boxing Day at the Howlett Manor, in which gifts are exchanged and emotions run high, and there is joy, and there is suffering, and there is a very abrupt ending to the story, to this first issue of the story. It's what I would call a bad chapter break, actually. And there's the Boxing Day celebration. Little dog runs home with a toy that kindly Master John has given him, and his drunk of a father promptly breaks it and beats his son for accepting something from those people up on the hill whom he vitriolically resents, does older Mr. Logan, breaks the toy, and then we end with an image of a dog just kind of crouching on the roof of the family shack, and that's it. There's no text page of any kind, no next issue blurb. It's what I would call a bad chapter break, and the fact that there are no other end of issue, none of the usual end matter one finds in a comic book. It is, to me, an all too obvious sign of this project's all too obvious intention for the direct book market. They were writing to the trade, as it were. Even the single-issue releases were kind of geared towards being immediately slapped together into a trade and sold to, Borders, because back in 2001, that was a thing. So the direct book market was briefly but intensely important, to the major comic publishers back in 2001. So that was a little bit of a disappointment that this first issue ended that way. And also another thing that I would cite as a criticism against this first issue of this miniseries, also a bit of a sign that it was intended to be released mainly as a trade. And for someone buying this as a single issue and trying to read it month to month, or optioning it as to read from month to month, there's really... It's short on traditional comic book style action, and there's no real X-Men related connection, other than the fact that Mr. Thomas Logan happens to look exactly like an adult Wolverine. There's nothing to hook in like the X-Men fans out there who want their X-Men to read like X-Men. I'm not saying this is in any way a bad story. I mean, the first issue, I enjoy the first issue quite a bit, and I enjoy the rest of the miniseries too. But if I were your standard X-head back in the early 2000s, and I were to pick this up, I would have seen nothing to reassure, my non-literary minded self that I hadn't wasted my money on an excerpt from The Secret Garden set in the Marvel Universe, because there are undeniable similarities between what we get in this first issue and the children's literary classic, The Secret Garden. But again, this is not really a criticism of the story. It's just the way the issues were spaced out and paced and the content organized within them to guide the reader through and to suck the reader in. For my own part, I liked this an awful lot. I'm usually a sucker for a comic book period piece, and this is absolutely that. So I loved that element of this story from my first skim through of this thing off the rack 15 years ago. I can't totally speak to the historical / regional accuracy of the attire, the vernacular speech, etc. of the characters, the historical details of the westward expansion into Canada at the time the story's supposed to be set, but it's everything Jenkins did in setting up the story and putting these period elements into place is strong enough in verisimilitude to sell me. So there you go. And honestly, if on my first flip through I had not been thusly sold, I probably, if the period hadn't seemed accurate enough to me, if the story hadn't seemed to be set long enough ago for what's supposed to be Wolverine's lifespan, i.e. well over 100 years, I probably would have left the thing on the shelf. But nope. Jenkins did right by me in setting up the period elements. The tone of the writing, especially the prose captions from Rose's diary, which is kind of our our first-person narration for the second half of the issue, excerpts from Rose's diary, it's exceedingly reminiscent of literature of the period. It makes one think of Dickens or Jane Austen, just a Victorian domestic drama and class friction are on display here, as there would have been in the writings of those authors. Also, a couple of period conventions are used here, like the mad wife in the attic. Very much like something right out of Jane Eyre, right there, or the cruel old patriarchal miser, which is John Howlett's father, who's always hanging around criticizing everything John does and scowling and excoriating his son for being too kind and close to the servants and all of that. Yeah, it rings true as reminiscent of both the historical truth and the literature of the period. So good job there, Jenkins, and doing that up well enough to fool this English major, for what that's worth. And Jenkins does a pretty good job of making Jenkins is a British subject himself, but he does a good job in writing the story of not making the dialogue sound too British, because after all, these are not British folk, these are 19th century Canadians. Now, even though several of the characters are presumably first-generation immigrants from Great Britain, it doesn't sound to me like I'm reading dialogue from British characters. So again, he's a good verisimilitude there from the writer. As far as the artwork goes, another major selling point here, the interior artwork by Andy Kubert are superb. Okay, the post-production is excellent as well. It's the art as it appears in the comic retains the original pencil texture and line shading throughout, thanks to the digital painting of Richard Eisenove, which, is a step above mere coloring, after all. And there are spots where you can, in the backgrounds, that they're colored in such a way as to simulate the texture of woven canvas, which gives the whole thing that painterly feel and makes it earn the term digital painting that much more. And the result is impossibly, it feels both polished and raw. Because you can sort of see the texture of a canvas has been inserted into the background of the images. It gives it that sought after painterly quality. It feels illustrated more than just drawn or penciled, which, needless to say, also adds to the period feel. As does, giving credit to the letterers, the heavy serif mock calligraphed font that's used for just about all of the dialogue in the issue. So, and that was provided by John Rochelle and also Saida Timofonte of Comicraft. I always like to, doff the cap to the letterers wherever possible. Theirs is kind of one of the more thankless jobs in comics, and I've insisted that we maintain the Best Letterer category of our Comic Geek Speak Best of Awards every year, and I'm giving them a bit of props here as well, and for their contribution to the period feel and overall enjoyability of the Origin of Wolverine miniseries. And there we go. Wolverine, The Origin, #1. This is an historically important comic. It was a big success at the time it was released, got a lot of buzz. It's a classic of the period, I would argue. It was deserving of the hype, I think. It was probably not what a lot of X-Men fans would have expected of a Wolverine origin story, but it was nonetheless a well-crafted comic. And it does bring to mind memories of the time period. I mean, Jenkins's byline as writer alone is kind of enough to date this thing, because not to take anything. By saying that, I don't mean to take anything away from him or his body of work, including this miniseries himself. But it's just kind of interesting to reflect that there was a time, some 15 years ago, when he was Marvel Comics' go-to golden boy of the moment. He wrote that Inhumans miniseries with Jay Lee artwork through the Marvel Knights imprint that got him in good with Quesada, and that was a very well thought of story. And he did a run of Spider-Man comics that went on for a couple of years and earned him the undying respect and admiration of quite a few fans. It lasts even on to today. But yet for a while there, he was the one that Marvel would go to with big projects like this. And then he sort of gradually drifted out of favor, and ended up at DC for a while, and he came away from that experience complaining of borderline verbal abuse that he had received from editorial there, and now he's kind of stepped away from the big two altogether, and he hasn't written anything for Marvel in something like 5 years. But this is a look back at the heyday of Jenkins' involvement with Marvel. Just compare his being tapped to write this miniseries instead of, say, an older creator who's more associated by fandom with the character. And then when they finally got around to doing the sequel to Origin, which is not very well thought. I haven't really heard anyone talk about the Origin 2 miniseries that came out a couple of years ago. The choice of the moment for that was Kieran Gillen, so go figure there. But yeah, so the Origin miniseries was good reading, if you're a fan of period pieces especially, and it does eventually, it becomes more obvious what its tie-in to the X-verse at large is. I mean, I'm not going to go ahead and spoil anything for you, but there's a bit of a surprise in store as far as, well, let's just say that the young Wolverine is not quite what readers are initially clearly meant to think he is. I'll leave it at that. And well, his relationship with Rose is shown developing here. And Rose is she's only 12 years old at the start of this story, but already the similarity in appearance between her and Wolverine's later paramour, or unrequited paramour, Jean Grey, becomes fairly obvious. So, this story reveals, among other things, why Wolverine became attracted to redheads later in his life, because he's remembering dear little Rose. So, yeah, fine little bit of early 2000s history here in this first issue of Wolverine: The Origin. All right, now let's execute an about-face and forge on away from a well-known Marvel comic in the direction of a more esoteric DC one. And this comic gives me yet another reason to wish that I had gotten around to getting this episode recorded several months ago, closer to the release of the Suicide Squad movie, because then my comments on same would have been a little more topical, because the comic book of which I speak is actually the first issue of a Suicide Squad ongoing series. That's right, there was one of those back in 2001. It's not very well known, and I assume not very well liked either, but it did happen. So this is taking us back to November of 2001 once again. Suicide Squad Volume 2. This is the first time DC had tried to produce a Suicide Squad ongoing series since the original, as written by John Ostrander, was reported KIA back in 1992. So, over the ensuing 9 years, the squad made numerous little cameo appearances here and there, featuring various different lineups of DC Comics supervillains, acting, as was the core concept as established by Ostrander, in the interests of the United States government, under duress, usually, in exchange for commuted sentences and other little perks like that. The last of these little cameos that the squad made before the beginning of this second volume of an ongoing series for them was actually as part of an Our Worlds at War crossover, where they were shown as as executing the designs of President Lex Luthor himself. They actually attacked Superman under President Luthor's clandestine orders as kind of a training exercise to prepare them for fighting Imperiex, I assume. At that point, it was former Sergeant and then General Frank Rock, of Easy Company, the classic DC Comics war character, who had ascended to a position in Lex Luthor's Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was holding the leash of the Suicide Squad. He had assumed that position from Amanda Waller, who had always been the handler of the Suicide Squad in the past. But Ms. Waller had her hands full with other duties by then. Again, in the administration of President Luthor, she had a cabinet position of her own as Secretary of Paranormal Affairs. So Frank Rock stepped in, and he was in charge of the squad briefly. Then he was shown dying heroically in a different Our Worlds at War related story. So Suicide Squad Volume 2, Number 1, I warned you we had not quite heard the last of Our Worlds at War as an event here on the Time Bubble, and here we are mentioning it the second time this episode. This first issue of Suicide Squad Volume 2 is, it's not bannered as any kind of an Our Worlds at War tie-in, but it is nonetheless an indirect unacknowledged spin-off of Our Worlds at War, what with the Squad's involvement with President Luthor and General Rock. And actually their involvement with Rock doesn't quite end there, as we'll see. But yes, so this does kind of spin out of the events of that miniseries, or well, I can't even call it a miniseries, that crossover event, in subtle ways. So it maintains the Ostrander-initiated core concept of Black Ops supervillain task force. But it's given kind of a new complexion by the creative team, which, since I haven't mentioned them so far, consists of Keith Giffen, classic DC Comics kind of humor maven, writing in his usual vein here. The pencils are by Paco Medina, the inks by Joe Sanchez. Edited by Stephen Wacker, who would later become famous for becoming one of the editors of the 52 maxi series. This is a Keith Giffen project, and the team of supervillains that he brings to this first issue of the new Suicide Squad series are a group of villains on which Giffen put his particular stamp with the help of his longtime collaborator and one might call him accomplice, J.M. DeMatteis, back in the 80s when they were writing Justice League. I speak of the members of the Injustice League. That's right. A group of down-on-their-luck sort of B, C, D, or, pick your own letter of the alphabet level supervillains of the golden and, not golden, the silver and bronze ages, shall we say, that Giffen and DeMatteis latched onto and put together in a team so that their somewhat silly, comedic, dysfunctional version of the Justice League could have someone even more silly, comedic, and dysfunctional to beat up on. They could be the Washington Generals of the Bwahaha era Justice League. That's kind of what the Injustice League was meant to be. They consisted of Major Disaster, who was an old Green Lantern villain who could generate disasters, Clue Master, a Riddler wannabe who fought Batman in the late 60s into the 70s, part of the New Look era, the Clock King, an old Green Arrow villain who these days is more associated with Batman, but originally not so, the Multi-Man, who fought the Challengers of the Unknown back in the Silver Age, and who had the power to die and then come back from death with a new superpower every time he died, and Big Sur, a Bronze Age Flash foe who was a.k.a. Doofus P. Ratchet. That was his real name. He was basically a very large, mentally challenged man who had unnatural strength and was fairly simple-minded, and he's kind of like a super-powered, armored version of Lenny from Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. Not a very politically correct character. A bit of an affront to mentally disabled persons. But he was always a part of the Injustice League from the start. And these are your 5. The Injustice League sometimes palled around with other characters, such as the rogue Green Lantern Gnort. And there was also a super-powered Berkeley hippie named the Mighty Bruce, but he wasn't contacted to be a part of the Suicide Squad. I guess he was washing his hair that day. Who knows? So this is your starting lineup for Giffen's new take on the Suicide Squad. They are brought together, and the people watching over them and sending them out on their first, and as it turns out, last mission, are war-related characters. I mentioned that the former Sergeant Rock, promoted to General Rock, was in charge of the squad briefly. But here we find his old second-in-command from the Easy Company days, Bulldozer Nichols, is in charge of the Suicide Squad. He's in contact with them via remote link. He's watching them via various little mini vidcams on his laptop. He's holed up in a seedy motel room. He's in a wheelchair, which is a little odd. It sends up little continuity flags right away, because the last time this character was seen, he was not in a wheelchair. He was actually he was running a military academy, as seen in Jeff Johns and Lee Motor's excellent Stars and Stripe series, which introduced the world to Courtney Whitmore, the Star-Spangled Kid, later Stargirl. And Stripesy, Pat Dugan's delinquent son, Mike Dugan, had been attending this military academy. Bulldozer was the I don't know, senior officer or whatever you'd call the like the headmaster of a military academy, of that military academy, and he certainly was walking around just fine without a wheelchair. We don't know what happened to put him in his wheelchair between then and the beginning of the series. It's something of a mystery. But Giffen, his storytelling style has never been to dot all the I's and cross all the T's right off the bat. He enjoys jerking the reader around a little bit, and so he leaves certain things unexplained until later, and certain other things unexplained, period, for the duration of the series, which was, as we'll see, not very long. But here we are in this first issue. We've got Bulldozer sitting in this hotel room, and the members of the Injustice League who have been somehow corralled, cozened, or hoodwinked into being members of this new incarnation of the Suicide Squad. And their first mission, as it turns out, is to rescue a missing scientist named Preston Paddington Bayer. That's B-A-Y-E-R. There's a kind of a juicy pun in there for those of you who are fans of Kitty Lit, who has gone missing and is believed to be held hostage by Icelandic terrorists, quote-unquote, in a mysterious compound on an island off the coast of Iceland. And so the former members of the Injustice League, who, believe it or not, actually had done a turn as heroes once before this, when they decided to throw in the towel, adopt the policy of if you can't beat 'em, join 'em, cease to be the Injustice League, and instead apply for membership in the Justice League during their Justice League International phase. And just to get rid of them quickly and quietly, the Justice League Embassy decided to assign them to Antarctica. That was their territory to defend. That was their franchise. So they became Justice League Antarctica for like 3 appearances, and then I guess went back to their bumbling villainous ways for a time. And now here they are, fighting the good fight, again, here as members of the Suicide Squad. And they're being sent to Iceland, another Arctic setting, where they're... polar is probably a better word, since Arctic is the exact opposite of Antarctica. I do realize that. Anyway, they're sent to a place that's very cold to do something weird, gross, and probably doomed to failure. Such is the Injustice League way, it seems. So they're dropped off on this island. They infiltrate the compound without much trouble, bickering amongst each other all the way, however, as characters written by Keith Giffen are usually wont to do. They discover the missing scientist inside, but he's being held captive not by terrorists, but by the scientist's own monstrous creation, which appears to be a giant, oozing, gargantuan gobbet of liver tissue with facial features. It calls itself Eve. It has certain psionic capabilities. It believes itself to be the scientist's wife, when in fact it's actually just a failed experiment at cloning a metahuman that the scientist had executed. And it sits around holding its husband, the scientist, hostage, and generating kids for them in the form of bizarre little... non-sentient homunculi called poppers. And these are little fleshy automatons that resemble perfect little Stepford children. They toddle around and say, "I'm a popper. Would you like to be a popper too?" And then they pop. That is to say, they explode with violent force. Big Sur is actually the first member of this version of the Suicide Squad to live up to the squad's name. He gets a little too chummy with one of these little poppers, and it explodes in his face, killing him instantly. Poor guy. So this version of the Suicide Squad has all this gross bizarreness to deal with. And as they they managed to rescue the scientist at a tremendous cost to their numbers. In fact, the only one to get out alive is Major Disaster. He's the one who's able to be debriefed and file his exit report, and we will next see him. This is kind of a career upswing for him. This was to Major Disaster what Pulp Fiction was to John Travolta, you might say. He makes a comeback after this and actually joins the Justice League proper, not the Antarctica franchise, but the big show, the major franchise, during the Joe Kelly era, I believe, and then he would go on to be a member of the Justice League Elite Squad. So, yeah, things looking up for Major Disaster. The rest of his teammates not quite so lucky. So, yeah, new Suicide Squad off and running, and lots of deaths. That's so par for the course there. It's making a statement in the first issue, I guess. Okay, so the plot, I've given you the rundown there. As far as the quality of the issue, it's Giffen writing the Injustice League characters again, so it's kind of a shame I didn't enjoy the outcome a little more. it's Giffen's trademark humor is still there, but for my taste, it's a little too acidic. It's lacking the base, the yin to his yang, I suppose you could say, that J.M. DeMatteis provided when the two of them used to work together, and when they would eventually work together again on things like Justice League 3000. His timing and cadence of dialogue, if that even applies to print dialogue as opposed to that delivered verbally, is still sharp. Certainly identifiably present. He's still good at writing verbal humor, but the quality of the patter aside, the characterization, the personalities of the characters as shown through that comedic dialogue is way off, I have to say. Except for Big Sir, poor, sweet, simple Big Sir, who's and maybe Major Disaster, too. They kind of sound like themselves. But the others, Cluemaster, Clock King, Multi-Man, for a couple of reasons I can see. Giffen seems to think he's doing a war comic here. And there's always been kind of a paramilitary bent to the Suicide Squad, but Giffen's taking that a little more literally than Ostrander usually did. Like the cover blurb is actually... on the front cover, the tagline is, "They make their living dying." It would sound... could there be a more, 60s and 70s war comic sentiment than that? And, there's also the fact that silhouetted non-diegetically against the horizon in the background of the cover image is Sergeant Rock himself, who... I may as well mention here at this point, the big reveal on the last page is still, apparently, the driving force behind this new, Our Worlds at War era Suicide Squad. Even though he was seemingly killed during Our Worlds at War, he's turned up seemingly alive again on the very last page. It's because throughout this issue, we occasionally cut to Bulldozer in his seedy hotel room, monitoring what's happening with the squad, and he's talking with someone unseen off page, and trading little bickering and banter, Giffen-style dialogue back and forth with this unseen interlocutor, and we learn on the last page that it's been Sergeant Rock, or General Rock, all along. So, I guess old soldiers never do die. it would appear, at least, in this issue. So that's kind of a curveball there. But Giffen seems to... He feels like he's writing a war comic. He takes that a little bit too seriously, though, as far as writing these characters that he and DeMatteis sort of redefined back in the 80s. And... so these Suicide Squad grunts, instead of talking the way that they've talked for years, instead of demonstrating the kind of, wishy-washy, neurotic personalities that Giffen and DeMatteis gave them, they all end up talking like Nick Fury. And it's a little distracting, for me at least. And then they almost all die, which kind of puts a further damper on the comedy, needless to say. In addition to that, the plot itself is... it's a little more weird and sick than funny. When you finally get to see Eve, it's not funny so much as it is gross, if you know what I mean. One interesting device that Giffen does employ here. There are several times during the issue, we do get little single-page... little character portraits, if you will. Just one page laid out in 9 panels, which is, a favorite trick of Giffen's. Even though Giffen is not the one drawing this issue, he tells his collaborator Paco Medina to set it up in the 9-panel grid that Giffen so often used in the 80s. And these single-page cutaways in the 9-panel grid are supposed to be little excerpts from... entry interviews with the different members of the Injustice League as they're being considered for use in the Suicide Squad. It's just 9 panels of the different characters. We really only see 2 of them. It's kind of a shame. I wish they would have gone ahead and done 1 page for each of the 5 of them. All we really see are Major Disaster and Cluemaster, the 2 most important characters here, because Major Disaster has been singled out for survival for use later on. And Clue Master is somewhat important because, as many of you listening may know, the Clue Master, a.k.a. Arthur Brown, is actually the father of Stephanie Brown, who by this point had become a fairly important supporting character in the Batman and Robin corner of the DC Universe. The spoiler. She was kind of a love interest for Robin, a vigilante in her own right, and she was established some time ago by writer Chuck Dixon as the daughter of, third-rate Batman villain, the Clue Master. So, Clue Master's death has a little bit of pathos here in this issue, and so I guess that's why he gets this little one-page cutaway where he's talking to an unseen and unheard interviewer. Each of these little one-page deals, each panel has a little clock face in the background, which shows time elapsed between comments made by the interviewed Injustice League member. So you get to see how much time passes between quips, and so Giffen is able to milk that little elapsed time device for humor in spots. So he's skilled that way. Give him credit for that. But again, I wish he could have done that with all of the squad members instead of just those two. Now, for those of you who, like me, like to show sympathy for underappreciated minor supervillains, don't like to see them just casually dusted off, as most of the Injustice League appear to be in this first issue, rest assured, almost all of the deaths depicted in this issue are eventually overturned in subsequent months and years, one way or another. I've already mentioned that Major Disaster survived. Clue Master. Major Disaster is actually fairly affected by Clue Master's death. And Giffen does give Clue Master a fairer shake than some, by establishing that Clue Master is he's got an eye for detail, which apparently is just as helpful at identifying, analyzing, and following clues as it is in concocting them and leaving them for Batman. So Clue Master proves pretty useful on this mission, and he saves Major Disaster's life several times as they attempt to escape with the asset, the missing scientist. And during his exit interview, Major Disaster says, and I quote, "Oh, and I don't care what you heartless scum say. Soon's I'm cut loose, I'm hunting down Clue Master's kid and telling her dad died a hero." Because, what they're doing is supposed to be strictly confidential, and they're not supposed to be revealing the details of their missions until they're declassified. But Major Disaster swears he's going to hunt down the spoiler and let her know about her dad. And I think he's as good as his word eventually in a later story somewhere. The Clue Master does get something of a fair shake, but eventually he does come back. It's revealed that he doesn't actually die on that island off the coast of Iceland. He's just rather badly injured, and he shows up badly scarred and disfigured, barely recognizable, as part of some elaborate scheme involving his daughter. I think it plays out in the Robin solo series. So Clue Master does come back. The Clock King somehow shows up again. It might not be William Tachman inside the costume anymore. I'm not sure, but yeah, he's portrayed as the team's efficiency expert here. No need to synchronize watches while this guy's around. His only power appears to be having an uncanny knack for estimating how long certain tasks will take to complete, or the probability of how much time is going to elapse before certain things happen. He's pretty good at that, but he's also pretty good at stopping bullets, apparently, because he's brought down by a hail of them near the end of this issue. But Clock King in some form lives on, of course. And Multi-Man, of course, coming back from the dead is his shtick. So during this issue, he exhibits the power to shrink things. There's always an annoyingly unpredictable period of time between when he comes back from the dead and when he figures out what his new power is going to be. And about halfway through the issue, he suddenly goes, yes, my power is to shrink things, and he shrinks a few of those exploding popper kids I mentioned earlier. But he does, of course, come back from the dead and is used by other writers. He plays a prominent role in the Chuck Dixon-written Last Laugh crossover event, which we will get to at a later time on this very podcast. Oh, you're going to love that one, folks. Really only Big Sir of the Injustice League members who are a part of this Suicide Squad lineup. He's the only one that doesn't shortly return from the dead. And it's probably for the best, because as I said, Big Sur is not a politically correct figure. He was kind of an ill-advised character even when he was created. I think Cary Bates created him. Anywho, that's how this first issue begins the second volume of Suicide Squad. The issue is entitled Almost a Good Idea, which is kind of a riff on certain pessimistic remarks that Bulldozer is making at the beginning of the issue about what a bad idea he thinks this new version of the Squad is. And I quote it here for truth, because you could probably apply that same phrase, almost a good idea, to this whole second volume of Suicide Squad. It didn't have a very long run. It lasted exactly 12 issues, beginning in November of 2001, ending exactly a year later. I can't say that I read very much of it. I bought the first issue and the last 3 issues, I believe. So I was there at the beginning, I was there at the end, and so I don't have a complete picture of the year-long arc of the series, but the sense I get of it is that it gets stranger and less appealing as it goes. Giffen, he brings in several characters of his own creation who aren't especially likable or memorable to serve as a kind of core support staff for this new Suicide Squad. He brings in a couple of DC Universe regulars as guest villains to be part of the squad. He brings in a couple of characters of Ostrander's creation as villains towards the end, like an updated version of a team of Middle Eastern stereotypes, largely, called the Jihad, renamed the Onslaught in 2001. Pretty timely, too, because since this comic is published in September of 2001, Jihad was very soon to become a loaded word. But of course, this is nearly a year later by the time these characters are brought back in. So, yeah, plenty of time to rethink the use of the name The Jihad as a name for a team of villains. So anyway, there are some things in this series, I guess, to appeal to fans of Ostrander's classic 80s and early 90s Suicide Squad run, but in the end, it's just not the same animal and a less enjoyable animal, really. And I may as well throw in a mention of the artwork here by Paco Medina, which is maybe a little too cartoony for my taste, and it doesn't really jibe with the blood-drenched imagery of violence that we're treated to in the course of this first issue. And it's certainly not the last issue of this series where death occurs. So yeah, it's kind of a non-starter, this second volume of Suicide Squad. I mentioned it's not very well remembered, and so yeah, that's kind of it's been reduced to kind of a strange footnote in what has become the long, tortuous, and epic history of the Suicide Squad as a concept. But it's a peculiar little historical footnote, and that's what we enjoy here on the Time Bubble. So if you're interested in checking it out, just look for the cover logo, the title dress that features the 2 lowercase letter I's in the word suicide, styled as little men's room stick figures pointing pistols at each other over the letter C between them. That logo was used only on this 2001 series. So if you see that in the back issue bins, that will be the 2001 Volume 2 that I've been telling you about at length here. I don't precisely recommend it, but it might be something to check out if you're a fan of oddities. I may dip back in and tell you something about the final issue when we get to it, because the series ends on a strange and perplexing note, where you can just practically see, or in your mind's eye, Giffen smirking at the reader at the strange way he ends things. Like I said, he does occasionally like to mess with the reader, and he certainly does do that. Via the involvement of Sergeant Rock and Bulldozer at the end. The squad just sort of falls apart randomly, and that's the end. So I'll try to remember to give you more detail about that when I get around to the Suicide Squad Volume 2, number 12, when that bubbles up to the top of my to-be-reviewed pile. All right, then. Ad astra per aspera. Let us move on right back in the direction of Marvel and straight to the sacred spaceways of Marvel Cosmic. This is a comic that I waited a long time to read, and well, of course, being 13 years behind on my reading, I technically wait a long time to read every comic book that I read. But this is one that made me aware of how long I was waiting to read it. My anticipation for it was greater than for some. This is The Avengers Celestial Quest, issue number 1 of an 8-issue miniseries, written by Stainless Steve Englehart, classic Bronze Age writer returning to the Marvel fold for this story he'd been dying to tell for years, with pencil art by Jorge Santamaria and inks by the Prince of Inkers, Scott Hanna. Love this guy's work. He can make almost anything look good. So, great choice. A pretty good creative team here for this Marvel Cosmic story. So, this miniseries is Englehart's golden opportunity to tie up decades-long loose ends here. Specifically, it's the Celestial Madonna, Celestial Messiah story that he started back in the Bronze Age. It's Englehart's chance to revisit the Celestial Messiah and the saga of the ex-Avenger Mantis, a favorite character of his. Plot threads that are left dangling from a couple of Englehart's tenures on Avengers-related comics, including a run on West Coast Avengers, which at some point had left Mantis divided into several different selves. And Englehart got into some kind of creative dispute with editorial and walked off West Coast Avengers, and his story had to be resolved fairly quickly. Mantis was kind of left in limbo for a time. Several different things have been tried with the character for the years since Englehart's unceremonious exit, most of which Englehart chooses to just overlook when he comes in to write Celestial Quest, and with impunity, and perhaps justifiable, since a lot of the things that were done with Mantis in that time weren't that respectful of continuity to begin with, so why should he respect that which disrespected continuity, if you follow me there. I barely follow myself. So Englehart was, as I said earlier, he was just really hot to get back to this story. He really wanted to resolve this, get some creative closure. Now, so intent was he on following through on the Mantis storyline that he actually carried Mantis and her little Celestial Madonna quest over into work he did for other publishers. Including DC, and I think something he did for Eclipse. That's how little Englehart wanted to let this go. So this was big doings for him when he finally got the chance to come back and wrap this story up on his own terms in 2001. And right out of the starting gate, the story is immediately steeped in the high-flown sidereal strangeness of those star-crossed 70s in which Englehart made his name. The very first caption, the words uttered in this story, it begins on a first-person narrative caption, "I don't know my name," followed by a much larger first-person narrative caption that also serves as the title of the story, "I die unknown." Wonderful Bronze Age style bizarre melodrama happening there, and it only gets better from there. So the first half of the issue follows the fates of the 5 sub-personae into which Mantis had been divided years before. So Mantis is living 5 lives in 5 corners of the world, which, if connected by lines on a map, would form a perfect pentagram. A bit of hippy-dippy pseudo-mysticism that 70s writers were so fond of there. So we had 5 different Mantises to catch up with, defined or encapsulated in the parlance of the story as, respectively, a freak, a mother, a prostitute, a priestess, and an Avenger. And so we're shown little sequences in which, one by one, these characters, living in the 5 corners of the world, Bombay, India, and yes, I'm aware we're supposed to call it Mumbai now, but screw that. It's called Bombay in the story, and I'm old and stubborn, and so Bombay it is. Western Hemisphere rules. So Bombay, India, London, Melbourne, Australia, someplace up in Alaska, and Willimantic, New Jersey. Those are the 5 points of the pentagram of destiny for Mantis. The Bombay Mantis is living as a green-skinned dancing carnival freak in Bombay. She's miserable, she's amnesiac, not happy at all. The Mantis of Willimantic, New Jersey is a mother. This is the one who actually gave birth to the Celestial Messiah, who subsequently went out into outer space to live with his father, who is... now try to follow along with me here, who is a member of the Kotati race who has been shaped into who has possessed the animated corpse of Mantis's former human lover, the Swordsman. And so he's kind of like an alien plant creature in the form of a dead Avenger, and he is the baby daddy of the Celestial Messiah. So the Celestial Messiah is now out in outer space. We'll be catching up with him shortly as this miniseries progresses. The third Mantis is a prostitute living in Melbourne, Australia. The London Mantis is a mystical priestess following the ascetic disciplines of the alien priests of Pama, living in Kew Gardens in London. And the fifth Mantis is wandering around somewhere up in the Alaskan wilderness. And so we catch up with them one by one, as one by one they die. Unknown, as the title informs us. And who is delivering this death unto them? Why, none other than, dramatic pause here, Thanos of Titan. Or so it would appear, at least. I'll elaborate on that in a moment. But yes, it does seem to be Thanos that is going about here. It's Thanos the Mantis Hunter is the obvious instigator of this story, as he goes around slaying the Mantises one by one in the hopes of absorbing their power and or neutralizing Mantis's ability to interfere in his ultimate plan to go after and slay her son, the Celestial Messiah. So yes, he's going about and he's killing all these different Mantises. The second to last one he encounters and kills is the Mantis of London, who is a mystic priestess, and she has certain abilities of her own that make her nearly an equal for Thanos. But when she claims to be an equal, that's when Thanos gets angry and finally lands the killing blow on her. But not before she sends out a psychic distress signal to, of all people, the Vision at Avengers Mansion. And so that signal goes out to him as she dies, and quickly relays the situation to him and lets him know the coordinates where he needs to go to rescue the last remaining Mantis of the 5 schismed Mantises that Thanos is methodically seeking out and killing. Vision immediately snaps to action. He gathers together a ragtag, unusual little team of Avengers characters who happen to be literally hanging out at Avengers Mansion in an obscure little basement room playing video games together. But he just kind of rounds them up, puts them in a Quinjet, and off they go to Alaska, just in time to turn the table of the battle between the final Mantis and Thanos in Mantis's favor. It gives her enough time to reintegrate, absorb the freed and scattered life forces of her 5 sister selves into herself. She becomes once again united and whole, the Celestial Madonna once again, and Thanos is perhaps in a bit of trouble. So there's your basic story outline for the first issue of this cosmic odyssey on which this little group of Avengers characters, and by proxy the reader, are about to embark. So, yeah, like I said, this story's got Bronze Age cosmic goodness in spades. I like what Englehart does with the Mantis character in the onset here, because it's Mantis's 5-way stelliform schism is a perfect metaphor for the me generation's eternal quest for self-discovery, which is doomed ultimately by time, mortality, and the onset of maturity, all of which are played tonight in our drama by Thanos. So yeah, it's good, it's bizarre, it's starry-eyed, golly gee wow, Bronze Age me generation storytelling. It's ultimately as worthy of Steve Gerber as it is of Steve Englehart, and that is intended to be a compliment. Where the first issue of this miniseries falls a little short for me, though, is actually in the portrayal of the aforementioned Thanos. The portrayal it's fairly stirring. His speech patterns, at least, are gotten down right by Englehart. I'll give him credit for that much. It'll be at least palatable for hardcore Thanos fans. But as the issue wears on, and especially as later issues of this miniseries wear on, the portrayal of Thanos comes to seem more and more erratic, even for Thanos, more out of character as the series unfolds. One notable point to bring up is that Thanos has taken to referring to himself not so much as a worshipper or agent of death, but as the god of death. I think later issues see Thanos making statements to the effect that he's outgrown his worship of death and has now decided to seize control of the idea of death as his own purview. which makes absolutely no sense for the way the character has been portrayed in the past. It's a little like if my fellow geek Shane started referring to himself as the God of Carleen, which, if you don't know, is his wife's name. Or if any of you listening who are lucky enough to have significant others, wives or girlfriends, husbands or boyfriends, and you started calling yourselves the gods of those individuals, as if instead of your partners and lovers, they were merely abstract concepts which you drew upon for your power and over which you claimed yourself to be the master. It would not bode well for your future fates if you exhibited such hubris as to claim godhood over your lovers, because that's basically what Thanos is doing when he refers to himself as the god of death. It's much, much out of character for him, and therefore it's perhaps not too surprising that Avengers Celestial Quest is one of the Thanos stories that Jim Starlin, who's the creator of and frequent compurgator for the Thanos character, expressly disavows. Nowadays it seems that every time Jim Starlin sits down to write a Thanos story, he has a little checklist in mind of recently published Thanos stories by other writers that he feels do a disservice to the character and which he wishes to explain away. And so I think when he addresses this story and the Thanos that appears in it would be in the Infinity Abyss miniseries that Starlin would write not too far in the future from 2001, in which we're told that the Thanos seen in Celestial Quest is actually a rogue clone of Thanos created by Thanos for some project or other of his that then escapes and begins its own warped machinations, and so it's basically the Doombot defense, just in a nutshell. But again, it's the Thanos. Even if Thanos's motivations and goals and actions don't quite jibe with the classic portrayal of the character as set by Starlin, Englehart does put the right sort of words in Thanos' mouth. His speech patterns are down, and he's got the right bearing to be the Thanos that hardcore Thanos fans would recognize. So anyway, moving from that back to things to like about this issue and the miniseries that stems from it, the squad of Avengers that Englehart chooses to be the sort of earthly identification point, the POV characters for the mortal readers of the series. As I said, it's a small and unusual, eclectic little handful of Avengers, but it's an intimate group, and there's bound to be some good chemistry among them. Some good character moments are drawn from them by Englehart as writer. The team, to wit, is Thor, God of Thunder, the Vision, and his ex-wife, the Scarlet Witch, and a somewhat minor reservist Avenger named Silverclaw, introduced by Kurt Busiek during his post-Heroes Reborn run on the title. The deal with her is that she's the daughter of a minor volcano goddess named Peliali. She's born in the fictitious Central American country of Costa Verde. Her father's a human man, and her mother's a goddess. And she has silverish skin, and she has the ability to morph into various animals. And I'm not very clear on what her other powers would be beyond that. Her real name is Maria de Guadalupe Santiago, and Jarvis sponsored her as part of these donate money to help disadvantaged children in other countries programs that you see advertised on late-night television sometimes. So she refers to him as Uncle Jarvis, and at one point she comes to the United States to visit with Uncle Jarvis and ends up becoming a reserve Avenger because she happens to have superpowers. And here she is. She becomes part of this little Avengers away team in the Avengers Celestial Quest miniseries. This miniseries is probably the best usage Silverclaw ever got, and it's not even being given to her by the writer who created her, for crying out loud. So, it's a neat little intimate group of Avengers that go out into space to participate in this celestial quest. And there is actually one more last-minute addition to this merry earthly band of champions, who is not officially a member of the Avengers. He's actually an ex-member of the Suicide Squad. Fun little continuity footnote this guy is. His name is Haywire, alias Harold Danforth, and he was part of the Suicide Squad for a time. In the Mark Gruenwald written Suicide Squad 12-issue maxi series of the 80s, which was a Book of the Month Club selection by Comic Geek Speak several years ago. He is shown as a reformed supercriminal who became a member of Nighthawk's Redeemers, basically like a spin on the Outsiders, you might say. It's a group of characters that the suicide on the brain now, Squadron Supreme's Nighthawk, a Batman analog, gathers around him to help him take down the Squadron Supreme, whom Nighthawk feels have gone too far in their utopian project to try and make the United States a paradise through behavior modification. So Haywire becomes a member of Nighthawk's group that's taking down the Squadron Supreme. Eventually, Haywire ends up joining the Squadron Supreme. He's with them when they make the jump to Earth 616, the mainstream Marvel Universe Earth, and they get stranded there for a period of years, during which they spend most of their time cooling their heels at Project Pegasus and not really doing much. Then finally, during Kurt Busiek's run on the Avengers, the post-Heroes Reborn run that I mentioned a moment ago, during the early issues when George Perez was still doing the artwork, we have a story where the Squadron Supreme is manipulated into battling the Avengers, and at the end of that issue's, I think it was a 2-issue story actually, at the end of that story's events, they finally get their opportunity to go back to their native Earth. And it's at this point that Haywire decides to part company with the Squadron, actually. And there is a very specific reason, extra-textual, that is, for his decision to do that, to stay behind on Earth 616 while the rest of the Squadron heads back to their Earth. And it has to do with the immediate plans for the Squadron after that Avengers story in which they appear. They were scheduled to go directly from there into a Len Kaminsky-written one-shot called Squadron Supreme New World Order. And Kaminsky had planned to just unceremoniously kill off Haywire on re-entry to the Suicide Squad's Earth so that Kaminsky wouldn't have to deal with him. And Busiek, bless his soul, as the patron saint of continuity obscurities, he was uncomfortable. He deserves to be canonized for this. I've gushed about his decision to save Haywire's life, as it were, a couple of other times, both on this podcast and on Comic Geek Speak. But Busiek was uncomfortable with the idea of sending Haywire to die that way at Kaminsky's hands. So he said, look, Len, I'll just keep Haywire on Earth, okay? I'll just have him decide to stick around on Earth to find himself for a while, just bum around and see what this strange new Earth has to offer for him. And so that he doesn't have to be a sacrificial lamb or a casualty of writer's convenience in the Squadron Supreme New World Order one-shot. And so that's how it was that Haywire was sitting around on Earth. And so that's, just praise be to Busiek. He's a writer who's, the characters in these comics that he writes are not just implements or tools to him. They're not just disposable commodities as they are to so many other writers. He feels a genuine empathy for them, and he feels that universes are richer for the presence of more and more varied characters, and he's always wanted to make use of the existing resources of a rich and varied fictional universe like the Marvel or DC universe, rather than just create new characters. So I sing his praises every opportunity I get, and this is one of the little writerly gestures of Busiek that's secured my devotion to him. I'm just sorry that we don't get to see his work in comics more often, but thank goodness we've still got Astro City. How about it? Okay, so anyway, Haywire was available. He's kind of another loose end in the Marvel Universe, cosmic quadrant that could be tied off here. And Englehart decides, just probably also inspired by Busiek's magnanimity in sparing Haywire's life, Englehart decides to give the guy some work, and he drafts him into this story, because it just so happens that Haywire, after drifting around Earth 616 for a while, has arrived in Alaska in the vicinity of the battle between Thanos and the final Mantis that he's trying to kill. It's taking place right near Mount Grunwald, definite tribute to another past master and friend of continuity in the hallowed halls of grand old Marvel, Mark Grunwald, who was also the creator of the Squadron Supreme and of Haywire. There you go. So Haywire shows up, and before the Avengers actually arrive on the scene, Haywire gets in there. Haywire's superhuman power is to generate in dense little packets of solidified psionic energy that the tendrils of psionic energy that share the physical properties of metal wire. So it is kind of mental. It's a Freudian slip there. It is mental wire. Literally, he calls it his tangle wire, and it's just strong enough to actually hold the Mad Titan for a few seconds, long enough for Haywire to go over and offer some help to Mantis, and for the Avengers to arrive. The Avengers then enter the fray and delay Thanos a little bit longer, long enough for Mantis to reintegrate herself, become one again, and really put Thanos on the ropes. And the first thing that Mantis does as she becomes whole again is to refer to herself as this one, which was part of the character's classic speech patterns back in the Bronze Age. And I think it's supposed to be kind of an outmoded stereotype of Asian womanly modesty that she eschews using first-person pronouns, always refers to herself as this one. The other versions of herself that existed in Willimantic, New Jersey, Melbourne, etc., they all had no problem calling themselves I and me, so apparently Mantis has more self-respect when she was splintered than she does when she's reintegrated as the Cosmic Madonna. Now, mind you, in later issues of the miniseries, she doesn't insist on referring to herself as this one. She mixes it up a little bit, but still, that's a convention of the character that we could probably just leave by the wayside. I'm kind of hoping that when Mantis turns up in the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 movie we're supposed to get later this year, Mantis will not be doing that. So, anyway, little tangent there. So we've got an interesting little group of characters. Haywire is on board, and sky's the limit after that. Because the first issue, a little like the first issue of Wolverine: The Origin, it ends in something of an awkward spot. It's a decent cliffhanger. Mantis is whole again. She's got her powers. Thanos is falling over backwards at the explosive release of energy that Mantis has just created. But unlike Origin, it is a somewhat thrilling cliffhanger, and also unlike Origin, I can't honestly say that the miniseries improves that much as it goes. Wolverine: The Origin is, in the end, a pretty neat little period piece. This one falls a little flat by the end of its 8-issue run, I have to say. Now, the early issues are pretty good. The first few issues are strong. The next thing that happens after issue number 1, the Avengers plus Haywire plus Mantis, they all go out into outer space to check in on Mantis's son, Sequoia, also known as the Cosmic Messiah, who has been living with his alien plant creature Kotati father out there in space, and he's grown up to be an obnoxious teenager who insists on being called Q, which is, as he puts it, the weirdest Earth letter, and all he wants to do is to escape the little monastery he's been raised in and travel the stars and do everything he can to dodge his destiny of being the Cosmic Messiah. Meanwhile, Thanos wants to kill him, and bringing death, ruin, and non-being to the entire universe. And his motives get more and more erratic as the miniseries wears on. He empowers a bunch of space pirates to be his minions, elevating them to demigod status. If he's the god of death, he needs demigods to slave under him, I guess. So for the first couple of issues, it's good. We get some good character chemistry, as I've mentioned. Silverclaw and Haywire sort of hit it off a little bit, since they're the two characters who have the least idea what's going on, the two characters with the least shared history with the Avengers, and so they're kind of the outsider's perspective to all of this, the newbie's perspective. Meanwhile, we've got Thor with the bluster and the bravado and the hey and the ho-ho and the cosmic. and we've also got a little bit of a love triangle happening between Vision, who did share a very brief bit of romantic tension with Mantis back in the day, and his ex-wife Scarlet Witch, whom he apparently told about this romantic tension at some point while they were still married. Even though Vision and Scarlet Witch are technically not husband and wife anymore at the time of this series, there's still kind of strong shared feelings between them, and so Mantis is kind of playing up to Vision a little bit. Wanda's not liking it, and so that's a little kind of a fun thing to watch. But as the story wears on to its conclusion, well, let me just say that even with my not unconsiderable powers of recollection, I can't exactly remember how this miniseries ends. The conclusion completely failed to leave an impression in me, and that is not a good sign, folks. That this miniseries, it's off to a good start. I would, if this were an off the rack, I would probably give the first issue a buy, but the miniseries as a whole, it doesn't come to a great end. And I hope it granted Steve Englehart and some people who were around and reading comics when this whole Mantis Celestial Madonna saga got started some closure, but for me, yeah, good beginning, but less good ending. So, mixed bag. And one extra note, in addition to, sounding off on the stories and the historical context of same that I talk about here on the Time Bubble, I sometimes like to cast the bubble spotlight on little extra textual bitsies that show up in the comics. Cool advertisements, things that speak to the broader popular culture scene of the time, things that tie into the state of the publisher at that time, the publishing philosophies betrayed by things that can be seen in these issues that aren't directly related to the stories they contain. So something like that happening here at the middle of this issue, what I like to call staple point, the midway part of a comic book, when you see the staples that are holding the comic together and you realize that you've read through half the pages of the issue you're holding. If you turn to the center of Avengers Celestial Quest #1, you will find a bullpen bulletins page. And that was becoming something of a rarity in late 2001. The bullpen bulletins page had been a Marvel mainstay for many years, and it was kind of being phased out by the end of 2001. But here, it's part of a 2-page centerfold, although only the equivalent of 1 page's worth of space is actually taken up by the bullpen bulletins. It occupies the right half of the left-hand page and the left half of the right-hand page, the center of the 2-page spread, and it's bookended on either side by an ad for the video and DVD release of Spy Kids, the movie, on video and DVD. Yes, in late 2001, you could still find ads that placed video. Not only does it mention VHS, but it still puts it above DVD in terms of priority. Nowadays, you're lucky to even find DVD mentioned in ads for a home video release. It's usually more like on digital and Blu-ray. Even Blu-ray, that which supposedly replaced DVDs, is now taking a backseat to another medium. Such swiftly changing times we're living in. But in late 2001, they were advertising Spy Kids on VHS. What they weren't advertising, and this is also telling, Bullpen Bulletin's page traditionally would include little checklists of coming comics or currently available comics available from Marvel. Things that you could find on your local newsstand or at your local specialty shop. But this Bullpen Bulletin in this comic of November 2001, or technically September 2001, does not actually mention any of Marvel's current comics. The closest it comes is one item that mentions Wolverine, Volume 1, number 167, on sale now, saith the blurb, which features a guest appearance by NSYNC. When you're hot, and today no group is hotter than NSYNC. Oh, 2001. Yes, indeed. But yeah, the rest of the Bullpen Bulletin's items found here, it's mainly stuff having to do with movies and TV projects and bits of news and gossip coming out of the, as of the time when this Bullpen Bulletins page was slapped together, recent San Diego Comic-Con of that year. A couple of notes from the personal lives of editors and writers, marriages and birth announcements, things of that nature. And also an item that is meant to draw your attention to the already large and unmissable ads for Spy Kids seen on these 2 pages. So already, even in late 2001, the encroaching influence of big media, movies, TV, and so forth, and the undue influence they were beginning to have on our beloved medium of comics, it had already begun. It's a slow tragedy unfolding here, and it's kind of implicitly present if you read between the lines of this Bullpen Bulletins page, which is one of the last of its kind, sad to say. And so it goes. Well, one more stop to make here on our intertemporal itinerary, folks. And, we've done a couple of Marvels, a couple of DCs, but Marvel tips the balance in this installment of the Time Bubble, in that our last comic to be discussed will be sort of a Marvel comic. It is a part of Marvel continuity, certainly, but it appeared under a then-new imprint of Marvel Comics called Max Comics, or Marvel Max, which was their mature readers only imprint. I'm talking about a comic It's something else that would have been a little more topical if I'd gotten around to talking about it several months ago, but it's the first issue of Alias by writer Brian Michael Bendis and artist Michael Gaydos, colors by Matt Hollingsworth. The first appearance of the character Jessica Jones of Netflix fame. Yes, that's right. I've got the first issue of that right here in my hot little hands, just ready to talk about it to you. In fact, I've actually got it down in my notes here. Just, again, facepalm here about not getting this done a few months sooner than I have, but first thing on my notes is the new Jessica Jones #1 is an upcoming off-the-racks pick for CGS. And now here we are, issue number 7 has already reached stands, and I'm just now getting around to talking about this comic. Oh, well. Time is, after all, relative, as they say. Or as Jeffrey Rush will soon be telling us in the National Geographic original series Genius, time is but a stubborn illusion. I like that. I may actually end up watching that series. Looks good. Anyway, so first issue of Alias by Bendis and Gaydos. Right there on the front cover, one of the things that would visually distinguish this series is the beautiful painted covers by David Mack, and it's we've got an extreme close-up of a brooding image of Jessica Jones looking pensive, and shades of blue and purple, and there's sort of random Dave McKean-ish postage stamps to the one side of her face. Sure, whatever works. And down in the lower right-hand corner of that, well, in the upper left, there is the Max Comics logo, identifying this as a part of that then-fledgling sub-imprint of Marvel. And at the lower right, a huge, like an inch and a half across stamp emblazoned down there, reading Parental Advisory Explicit Content. Kind of funny that this should be showing up so soon after Marvel disassociated itself from the Comics Code Authority and announced that it would stop bearing the Comics Code seal on the covers of its comics. It brings to mind a statement Mark Waid once made about the glory days of the Silver Age, when all comics displayed the Comics Code Authority seal on the front cover, quote, big as a barn door. And so now here's Marvel, after having just divested themselves of the responsibility of displaying that self-same seal on the covers of their comics, they turn around and they put barn door-sized seal of a different kind on here to identify the comic as objectionable material. Most comics of the present day don't even bother to do that. But anyway, 2001, this is all kind of virgin territory at that point. So anyway, let's press on into this issue itself. As I mentioned, it's cover dated, like most of the other comics I've talked about so far in this episode. It was cover dated November of 2001, which means it actually was on shelves in September of 2001, just a couple of short weeks before the first broadcast of the TV show of the same name, Alias, which aired on ABC TV and is not to be confused with the Bendis comic book. No relation whatsoever, but it's just one of those nice supernatural synchronicities that serve as a perfect source of fuel for the time bubble. It's just fun things to point up. At September 30th, 2001, that's according to Wikipedia, that's when the TV show Alias first aired, and just maddeningly bad timing for Bendis and Company that this new series of theirs is out there and risks ambiguation with this new TV series, which was also extremely popular at that time. But no relation. Sidney Bristow doesn't work here. But yeah, so so Alias, as you probably, most of you know by now, is the tale of one Jessica Jones, Private Eye, and her adventures on the seamy underbelly of the sunshiny world of mainstream Marvel superheroes. Yeah, she's actually used to be one such superhero herself, got out of that life quite some years ago, but it never stopped following her around, and however she may try, most of the cases she accepts seem to end up involving costume do-gooders or do-badders or super-powered individuals in some way. Exempli gratias, right here in the first issue. The first time we see her... Actually, let me just begin with the very first panel. This comic begins earning its explicit content warning right off the bat. The very first word balloon we see in here, as if Bendis, in his puerile glee, just can't wait to make use of the freedoms that this Marvel Max imprint affords him. He drops an F-bomb right there in the very first panel, which is issuing from a client of Jessica's. She's just completed a pretty standard marital infidelity snoop job for a guy, and discovered that the guy's wife is not only cheating on him, but is apparently a mutant. And the client takes it badly, attempts to physically assault Jones for, tries to shoot the messenger for delivering him this bad news, and Jessica, who is superhumanly powered, has strength and invulnerability, puts the guy through the plate glass window of her office door, on which is printed the words Alias Investigations. That's the name of her firm, and it's kind of the eponym for the title of the series, I suppose. So there you are. She's involved in the freak cases right off the bat. A couple of officers of the NYPD stop by to just kind of shake their finger at her, take her statement about her having smashed her client through her door, and she just assures them she's acting in self-defense. They notice some photos on the wall of her posing with her former superhero colleagues in her very 80s superhero costume. They give her some unwelcome questions about that phase of her life. She simply answers. They ask her why she gave it up, and she simply answers, "Same reason I don't have my paper route anymore. I outgrew it." The officers go on their way. Jones sloshes on through her life. She goes down to Luke Cage's bar, gets tight, and has some... has a sexual encounter with Cage just to attempt to relieve the emotional numbness she experiences day after day. She takes on a new case, just kind of a standard missing persons job. A lady wants Jessica Jones to find her black sheep sister. Jessica tracks her down, finds that she's alive and well, living in New York, and apparently carrying on an affair with Captain America. Just another day in the surreal life of Jessica Jones, P.I. So, and that, in a nutshell, is the action of this first ever appearance of the character Jessica Jones. And I gotta say, having read it, this first issue made a pretty positive impression on me. I liked it more than I probably thought I would like it when I bought this issue. And this is the only issue of Alias that I actually bought off the rack years ago. And that, I will confess to having bought it mainly on spec, as a potential collector's item, rather than out of any expectation of enjoying the material. Because at that time, my position was fairly strictly anti-Bendis. I've gone on record as saying that I have not, at many times in my career as a comic reader, I haven't been much of a fan of Bendis' work. It's especially early on, when he first started writing for Marvel, I found it very annoying. I mean, he was into this whole sort of stylistic, prosaic jazz approach to writing dialogue. He just this artful repetition thing that he did, which really kind of annoyed me. It felt kind of inflated and self-conscious. It was described as snappy by a number of comics journalists, and all I saw in it was another adjective that rhymes with snappy. So it was definitely not my cup of tea. It seemed to me like sometimes when Bendis was writing, some of the projects that he didn't take quite as seriously as he might, he would sort of get bored with what he was doing and just start noodling with the dialogue, or at least that's what it felt like to me. I tended as a general rule to avoid the things that Bendis did back in the early 2000s, and I was not really a happy camper when he began assuming more and more power and influence over many important facets of the Marvel Universe, like when he started writing New Avengers, for example. But this I like. I can't say for sure whether in 2001, when I was 22, I would have liked it as much. But yeah, this I can't. This is Bendis light. I mean, this is Bendis curbing what I would have seen in 2001 as the stylistic tics or excesses or problems with his writing. For one thing, despite the fact that this was written at the dawn of the era of writing for the trade, which I think I've already complained about once or twice in this episode, I can't really accuse this first issue of decompression. The action is actually fairly tight. Bendis' dialogue is seen in this issue is actually far less self-repetitive than usual. It's actually more plain old naturalistic. He does a good job of capturing believable speech patterns. A good example is Jessica's second client of the issue, the lady's trying to find her sister. The speech that Bendis puts in her mouth brings across not only her nervousness at meeting with this private investigator and the state of distraction that her concern for her sister's well-being has driven her to, but also the general vacuousness of her personality. It all comes across very well in that character's long, rambling speech. So he captures naturalistic speech without falling into the repetitive, what I like to call the rondo mode of Bendis dialogue. Maybe Bendis just took this a little more seriously. Maybe it's the fact that he's back with his feet on more solid ground with a hard-boiled detective story, because Bendis was kind of a crime fiction guy at heart. So maybe he felt a little more grounded with this concept and was able to write more grounded dialogue as a result. And the premise itself is actually really pretty great. I love the idea of a gritty private eye investigating the seamy underbelly of superheroics in the Marvel Universe. And he did dig up some interesting story ideas as the series runs on, so I'm told. And again, I've read only this issue and the second issue, which I dug up some years later. I believe, actually, our friend Jim Dietz, who used to run the Gypsy Cafe in Pittsburgh, at one of his geek throwdowns after the Pittsburgh Comic-Con, when he would invite a bunch of CGS family members, as it were, over to his restaurant after hours. He had some comics of his sitting around for purchase, and I think I compensated him for his issue of Alias #2, and I have it. I have read those first two issues, but no further. After this first issue, I'm actually looking forward to experiencing a little more of this. This is actually pretty good stuff. Again, Bendis and I, as I've said at length, have kind of been at odds over the years, but I think I've sort of mellowed, and my tastes have broadened and become less narrow as I've aged, and Bendis, for his part, has also kind of mellowed, and some of the edge has worn off of his writing style over the years. So I guess you might say that Bendis and I have grown towards one another as the years have worn on here. Call it Murdo-tropism, or don't, if you'd rather not. I perfectly understand. But I think even if my 22-year-old self might not have gotten much of a kick out of Alias #1, I certainly did. And so thank you, Bendis, for that. One other thing that Bendis did that I appreciate with this series is he gives Jessica Jones an internal monologue, which it makes the character more accessible. It quickly makes her a little easier to like. So another good move on Bendis' part there. Turning attention for a bit to the art side of things, the visuals. So the art is by Michael Gaydos, and in general, I found it kind of lackluster, to be honest. It seemed to me fairly crude. Yeah, not really my cup of tea. But the whole thing, on more level than one, but visual and otherwise, it carries kind of a flavor of early Vertigo. Maybe it's just the idea of a former superhero who's sort of fallen from grace and found his or her way to a strange, surreal place of darkness and uncertainty. That was kind of the bag of the first generation of Vertigo series that DC produced in the early 90s. And Gaydos' art, maybe because of the similarity in subject matter, just kind of reminds me of what I think of as early Vertigo house style. It's not all that great. The colors are by Matt Hollingsworth, another guy who's done work for... Hollingsworth literally worked on several Vertigo series in the 90s, and I find his color work on Alias boring, but perhaps necessarily so. And each page is blanketed in a near monochromatic palette of grays and browns, blues and purples. It's fairly atmospheric coloring, and I guess it does serve to evoke the dirty, shadowy nature of the life and work of a private eye, but it just kind of make the whole thing look like a mudslide in Twilight to me. You know what I mean? It's just, again, not exactly my cup of tea. And I guess it's worth mentioning in passing that the editor of this series was Stuart Moore, who's another person who worked on this book who had a Vertigo pedigree. So maybe the early Vertigo flavor that I got from this is not entirely accidental. Something that Gatos did that I did like very much, though, is the costume design we see a couple of glimpses, as I mentioned, in framed photos that Jessica Jones has on the wall of her office of what Jessica looked like back in her superhero days, when she called herself Jewel and ran with people like Ms. Marvel and the Avengers. And the costume design there is totally 80s. It's and I'm not even talking like a retro quotation of the 80s. It looks like a costume that might have been worn by a superheroine active in the 80s. It's like a white, strapless jumpsuit off the shoulder with like powder blue trim, and her hair was kind of dyed a shade of cerise or pink. It really does look like an authentic 80s, like a period authentic 80s design. I totally would buy that this was a forgotten 80s character. Like maybe she was, Jewel was a limited term cross-promotion arrangement Marvel made with a toy company, like Micronauts or Rom the Space Knight. Gone and forgotten from the Marvel Universe when the contract with the toy company expired. But, of course, those characters, although they may not appear in a certain form as per the licensing agreement after said agreement expires, certain aspects of those characters can still be used by Marvel. Like, for example, Rom showed up in several Marvel comics after the arrangement with the toy company expired, and he couldn't show up in his Galadorian space armor anymore, but he could be like a humanoid being who was referred to as Rom. He actually attended Rick Jones's wedding in Incredible Hulk in the 90s. I remember that. So, such characters can occasionally have weird, depressing little afterlives in the superhero universes to which they're temporarily introduced. So I guess that's what happened to Jewel once that contract was up. She was kind of dumped out into the shadowy demimonde of a private investigator. So yeah, I totally do buy that costume design. It's quality. So that's one thing that Gatos did that was pretty good. And I was also pretty impressed by the visual storytelling. I believe I identified it as page 14. It's the beginning of the scene when Jessica meets her client, the one who wants Jessica to find her sister for her. And it's just a series of these oddly, seemingly randomly spaced little square panels that are extreme close-ups. Well, first an extreme close-up of Jessica's eye, and then close-ups of different... It's segmenting the physical appearance of her client. It's like a close-up of her mouth, one of her handbag, a jeweled bracelet, a high-heeled shoe, and I think my friend and fellow geek Matt, who also works as a professional investigator, not quite the same kind of investigator that Jessica Jones is, but he does work of a similar nature, at least. This is what you might call a data composite, this little series of oddly scattered square panels on page 14. It's a good representation of, it's a great example of how art can serve characterization, in that it's a representation of how a person like Jessica Jones, a person in her line of work, would train herself to perceive the world. When she meets a new person, she immediately trains her eye on the different visible details of the person's bearing, and what kind of clothing she's wearing, her mannerisms, her tics, her speech patterns. This person standing there in Jessica Jones's office is being broken down in Jessica's analytical mind into different little details, different clues that give her sort of a data composite picture of what kind of person is standing there in her office trying to hire her. So that's a pretty clever use of visuals there to further the characterization and to establish Jessica Jones's own thought processes for the reader. But on the downside, though, and this is, again, kind of a personal hang-up of mine, Michael Gatos proves guilty of panel recycling in this comic. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's one of those deals where you see the same, literally the same pattern reproduced over and over again, not even with minute differences made to it in all cases. There's a series of 6 panels on pages 15 and 16, which is just the same image of Jessica sitting there with a cigarette in her fingers. The trail of smoke rising from the cigarette is drawn differently in each panel, but otherwise it's completely unaltered. And this repetition of images is done multiple times in the course of the comic. And I can't necessarily hold that against Gatos, because I think Bendis I've seen this in a lot of comics that Bendis writes. He probably encourages his artistic collaborators to recycle panels this way. And, there's something to be said for it. I think I can kind of understand why it's done. I mean, there's... It provides a certain economy of line. It saves time and effort on the artist's part. Plus, that there's a kind of Warholian artistic statement that can be made by the frequent reproduction and reusing of the same image in a single work of art. But even all that said, it feels to me like a cheat, and I kind of go every time I see it. So even if it's a perfectly defensible practice, I'm sure, but it bugs me. So Gaydos is guilty of that, although I'm perfectly willing to believe that Bendis is actually the one who's ultimately guilty for it. He may have pushed Gaydos to tell the story that way and use his art that way. So, yeah. So like I said, this is an enjoyable bit of work, and even more meaningful to me because I've actually, between the time when I read this first issue of Alias, and when I sit down here to review it for the Time Bubble, I did actually get around to watching the Netflix series Jessica Jones Season 1. And I don't want to go off on too lengthy a tangent about this here, because we're supposed to be about the comics here on the Time Bubble. I don't really set aside much time for reviews from other media. But just to lay down one or two things here. The basic tenor of my remarks is going to be that I think the Alias comic is a heck of a lot better. I mean, even the 2-issue sampling I've had of the comic, I already like it about 10 times better than that Netflix series. Which is not to say that the Netflix series is worthless or anything like that. It had its moments, but on the whole, it falls well short of the potential that I can already see in this series, even after having read only the first 2 issues of the comic. And, in this first issue, a lot of the features of the Netflix show are already established here in this first issue. Jessica putting her clients through that plate glass window, it being constantly broken, that's like a running gag on the Netflix series. Her sort of guilty sex relationship with Luke Cage. So some of the things that become conventions on the TV show, they're set up in the early issues of the comic. And I gotta say, I prefer the comic's take on just about everything. The stuff that the comic and the TV show have in common are established here in this first issue with rather more brevity and grace than they're set up in the TV series. And I'm especially happy that Jessica's career as Jewel actually happened in the comics, which is so much better than the way it was handled by the TV show, which is basically Jessica never actually became a superhero. It was just kind of a joke at Jessica's expense by her gal pal Trish Walker, a.k.a. Patsy Walker, a.k.a. Hellcat. Made up this silly 80s costume for her and joked that she could wear it to fight crime, and Jessica just goes pff and blows her off. Nope. No, the character that I've seen in the first 2 issues of this comic is already a much stronger character than what Kristen Ritter was able to play in that series. I did not buy Kristen Ritter for 1 second as Jessica Jones in that series. It's like she felt to me more like the real, heavy air quotes there, since we're talking about a fictional character, of course, but the real Jessica Jones's whiny, scrawny little kid sister who's stomping around in the real Jessica's clothes and boots, swaggering around trying to act tough and not convincing anybody. So, yeah, the character was kind of miscast. I don't like the way many of the events were written. The whole Kilgrave arc, the way that character was written isn't exactly true to the Purple Man we know from the Marvel Universe. The arc was a little drawn out, and it probably should have been saved for the second season, in my opinion. The whole thing felt, the whole season felt kind of padded. And this is a conversation I was having with the elusive lone wolf geek Kevin Moyer during a recent get-together a few of us CGS guys had, Pants, Shane, Matt, Kevin Moyer, and myself at the local franchise of The Tilted Kilt. Just kind of a local CGS guys get-together we had. And Kevin likes to talk about Marvel-related stuff, and we talked about Jessica Jones for a bit. And we agreed that the first season probably... Kevin's suggestion was that the season should not have been 13 episodes. The Netflix Marvel people are trying too hard to stretch out a single story that's good for maybe a feature film length. To stretch that out to 13 hours that are kind of spinning their wheels and weakening their own product by trying to do that. They could have made the season shorter. That was Kevin's suggestion. My idea was that they could have padded it in a different way, rather than throwing in lots of junk like Trish Walker and Nuke and the extramarital affairs of Jerry Hogarth, attorney at law. They could instead have had Jessica work some self-contained cases, just do some episodic stuff where she handles, the kind of freak work that she's doing, related to superhuman goings-on in the Marvel Universe that Jessica investigates in the Alias series in the comics. They didn't have to have her doing this cat-and-mouse thing with Kilgrave for so much of the running time of the series. They could have just had her do things that were unrelated to that, and just saved Kilgrave as a big bad for the second season, maybe. But so anyway, long story short, that there were some, it had its good points, that Netflix series. The opening sequence was terrific. It was perfectly evoked just the look and feel and the mood of those purple heavy David Mack painted covers that graced so many issues of the Alias comic. So that was, and I kind of liked the cool jazz theme music with the heavy marimba. But yeah, it wasn't completely bad, but it could have been a whole lot better, and it certainly is not as good as the comic. I can tell that even after only reading 2 issues. So I've, at the age of 38, I'm prepared to read this comic in a way that I wasn't when it was released in 2001, and I gotta say, I am eager for more. And on that positive note, we have come to the end of the full-length reviews I intended to share with you here on this installment of Murd's Time Bubble. But before we go, let's do a few quickie mini-reviews. This is the lightning round I like to do at the end of these episodes. I like to call them either quick pops or tiny bubbles. I sort of alternate between them. I think we'll call them tiny bubbles this time out, just for fun. So just a few quickie, just 3 of them here. All of them from Marvel Comics, funnily enough. So the first we have Thunderbolts, Volume 1, number 55, featuring, as the cover tells us, the winner of the 1973 FOOM, Friends of Old Marvel, Create a Villain contest. So, and this was published in 2001, so, well, we at Comic Geek Speak, and I at Murd's Time Bubble in particular, don't have much room to talk about, not finishing what you start, but I'll just say a hearty and encouraging better late than never to Marvel, and big ups to writer Fabian Nicieza for remembering these Marvel, the company's obligation to a young fan named Michael Guerrero to make use of the the fan-created character that he submitted to Marvel that won that contest. He was promised that character would be used in a Marvel comic, and here in 2001 he is. And the world is introduced, however briefly, to Humus Sapiens. His real name is Sonny Barredo. He's from a little town outside Pittsburgh, and he's what would eventually become known as an Omega-class mutant. Frighteningly powerful, attuned to Earth's biosphere. He has powers related to the living things and also the geological dimension of the planet Earth, but he's so attuned to the collective life force of life on Earth that every time he uses his awesome powers, living things must die, because he drains their life forces randomly and involuntarily every time he uses those powers. So we get to see the rather non-politically correct Marvel superhero Arabian Night dropping dead out of the sky after one of Sonny's power usages. So, bit of closure there for Michael Barrero and for the Friends of Old Marvel here in Thunderbolts number 55. Then I've got the 5th issue of the anthology series Spider-Man's Tangled Web, part 1 of a 2-part story by Peter Milligan and Duncan Fagredo called Flowers for Rhino, in which the classic Spider-Man villain, whose special ability is running at things, hitting them with his head, and knocking them down, not known for his thinking ability, but when he develops a crush on a young lady, he decides to volunteer for a scientific experiment to increase his intelligence. So this 2-part story tells us the ramifications of that. Interesting little character study on classic Marvel antagonist there. And finally, another Marvel offering. It's a cool little jam piece. It's an Avengers story, a one-shot. It's kind of a big one, too. An 80-pager, as a matter of fact. It's called Avengers, the Ultron Imperative. As the title suggests, it is an Ultron story, which delves once again into the deranged family dynamic that the mad android Ultron perceives between himself, the Vision, Wonder Man, Hank Pym, the Grim Reaper, etc. And so it's yet another Ultron-engineered plot involving multiple androids and lots of mayhem. And it's brought to you by a great stable of creators. Kurt Busiek is the main, he's credited as architect and co-plotter, and wrote the script for a couple of pages too. Also as credited as co-plotter and writing quite a bit more of the script is rascally Roy Thomas. Also helping out with scripting is Roger Stern and the aforementioned stainless Steve Englehart. And on the art, we've got, some great talents here. John Paul Leone, Paul Smith, Tom Grummett, Carl Kiesel, John McCrae, James Hodgkins, Jim Starlin, Al Milgram, Pat Olive, Jorge Lucas, and Klaus Janson. So all this plus a couple of bonus pinups, too. Good stuff. A lot of bang for your buck there. All at an unheard of, for the time, cover price of $5.99. But I would say, even adjusting for inflation, worth the price of admission back in 2001. So, another goodie. All right, there we are, folks. I think we've reached the end of our journey at long last. Thank you for hanging in there with me and enjoying a few more of these shallowly buried treasures from late 2001. So, thanks for joining me once again on another leg of my odyssey, perhaps hopeless to get myself caught up on my reading. I'd like at this time, as I usually do, to encourage all of you to stop by thecomicforums.vanillaforums.com and leave your particular feedback about the remarks I had to make in this episode, and share your own thoughts, impressions, and memories of the comics that I have mentioned and reviewed in this episode from 2001. If any of them ring a nostalgic bell to you, by all means, please share your thoughts and feelings. That's what our forums are for, and I always like to hear from all of you. I may not be very good or very prompt at responding to your feedback, but I guarantee you every message and remark you leave is treasured by yours truly. So, thanks once again. I promise not to make you wait quite as long between this installment of The Time Bubble and the next one. I say that often, I know, but I mean it this time, really I do. So, in the meantime, keep on reading your comics. Keep your own to-be-read piles at bay, lest you find yourself 13 years behind, a fate that I wish on no one. And I will talk to you all next time.